A kid called 911 and hung up, and my partner said probably a prank, and something in my gut told me to go anyway. It was a Saturday afternoon, and I was parked outside a petrol station finishing an incident report when dispatch came through and said we had a 911 hang-up from a residential address on Claremont Road. Caller sounded young, said his dad wouldn't wake up, and then the line went dead. My partner Ryan was already shaking his head before she finished the sentence and said, "Kids, man, they have no idea what they're doing tying up the line like this." But something about the way the boy's voice had sounded on the recording when dispatch played it back made me put the car in drive before Ryan had finished his sentence, because that wasn't a kid messing around. That was a kid who was scared in the specific way that children get scared when something has happened that they don't have words for. We pulled up to a normal-looking semi-detached house, nothing unusual, no neighbors outside, no front door open, just a quiet Saturday on a quiet street, and I knocked, and after a few seconds, the door opened, and there was a boy, maybe 7 years old, wearing a dinosaur jumper that came down past his hips, and he looked up at me, and the first thing he said was, "I'm sorry, I know I'm not supposed to use the phone without asking," and his chin was doing that thing. Children's chins do right before they cry, and Ryan had his notebook out ready to log it as a false call, but I crouched down and asked him where his dad was, and his eyes went to the hallway, and he said he's on the floor in the kitchen, and he fell down, and I tried to wake him up, but he just makes noises and won't open his eyes. We went in, and his dad was on the kitchen floor, mid-40s, pulse weak and thready, a gash on his forehead where he'd hit the counter on the way down, and an open prescription bottle near the sink. I told Ryan to call for an ambulance, and I went back to the boy who had followed me to the kitchen doorway and was standing there holding the sleeve of his own jumper in his fist, and I said, "What's your name?" And he said, "Callum," and I said, "Callum, you did exactly the right thing calling us." And he said, "Am I in trouble because Dad says the phone is only for emergencies?" And I said, "This was an emergency, Callum, you got it exactly right." And he looked at me for a second like he was checking whether I meant it, and then he started crying properly. The kind of crying that had clearly been waiting since before we arrived. The paramedics got there in 6 minutes, and I stayed in the hallway with Callum while they worked on his dad, and he held onto the sleeve of my jacket without saying anything, and I let him. And at some point, he asked me if his dad was going to be okay, and I told him the doctors were going to take really good care of him, which was the most honest answer I could give, and he nodded like he was trying to be brave about it. His grandmother arrived 20 minutes later, and Callum ran to her and buried his face in her coat, and she looked at me over his head and couldn't get any words out, and she didn't need to, his dad made it. They told us later it was a cardiac event in another 15 minutes, and it would have been a very different outcome. Callum had been in the living room when it happened, heard the sound of his dad falling, went to check, found him on the floor, and remembered what his teacher had told his class about 999 and called, and then panicked and hung up because he was scared he'd done something wrong. I went back to the station and sat in the car park for a few minutes before going inside. Ryan said, "You all right?" And I said, "Yeah," and he nodded and didn't push it. About 3 weeks later, I was at the front desk when a man came in holding a small boy's hand, and it took me a second to recognize them, because the last time I'd seen Callum's dad, he was on a kitchen floor, and now he was standing upright, and he shook my hand and said, "I don't really know what to say," and I told him he didn't need to say anything. Callum was holding a piece of folded paper, and he held it out to me, and when I opened it, it was a drawing in green crayon of two figures standing outside a house, one tall, one small, both with big round heads, and underneath it, in uneven capital letters, it said Callum and the Policeman. I've got it folded in the top drawer of my desk. I don't know why I haven't put it up somewhere. I think I just like knowing it's there.